getting folks to, okay, gotta calibrate now. Yeah, just starting the conversation, having each person talk about what they see as the more or less obvious challenges that we're facing in New England in dairy farming. And then, let's start with the challenges, and then we can move forward with talking about how different folks might be meeting those. And try to use some of these interesting terms that were just introduced that I've kind of seen before but haven't thought in the context of dairy farming. Socio-technical regimes and innovation. What is the importance of kind of developing your own niche to protect yourself from broader market forces? That seemed to be something that we saw a lot in the video about how farmers are competing with California, etc. Is isolating yourself from a lot of that competition an important part of how we move forward? Those are the kind of things that I saw as being potentially interesting as a part of this conversation. So that's about as long as I wanted to talk at this point. So maybe we can just start with Lorraine and move down and get some thoughts going.
Okay. Thank you. I knew there was a reason why I brought this report with me. I have thought a lot too about the grasslands of New York. I live in New York. My farm is primarily based on grass. We do feed conventional grain, but we also are primarily grass silage, grass hay, extensive grazing. Several years ago, a group of friends of mine had approached Cornell about doing a study on what to do with New York State's grasslands. We currently have about 3 million acres of land that was formerly used in the dairy industry, so 3 million acres is a lot of natural resources, much of it sitting idle or not really used very much. So there's a report out called Green Grass, Green Jobs that Cornell actually did several years ago now. You can get it on the internet. I tried to propose this in some city venues about expanding our meat and our livestock production upstate. So I'll just give you a quick thing from the executive summary. While there are several alternative options for using grasslands, livestock production is the focus. There is an opportunity to integrate management-intensive grazing. A wide variety of livestock operations can be supported on underutilized grasslands, including dairy, cattle, sheep, goats, exotic species, pastured poultry, hogs, using for the production of forages, stored forages like hay. So this has been kind of a really area of interest of mine. We are hill country farmers. And I do feel there is kind of a redlining in the ag community that, there are the people who are farming on very productive lands, flat, open lands, making extensive corn silage. And then there are the kind of, smaller hill country farms where I think we've almost been left for dead in some ways. So I would like to see some ways of advancing this sort of program, seeing our grasslands as a natural resource, and also support for that type of thing. Some things that I thought the community could do, or especially the educational community, working with farmers in terms of knowing how to market milk, branding of regional milk products, which is something I'll be working on next week with talking about branding for the Mohawk Valley area that I come from. So I'll just pass it on to the other people for now, and I'm not sure if we'll return more in policy, but I wanted to just, Melanie was actually maybe we were channeling before we got to the conference, so I'm going to give you this report before I leave Melanie.
Well, I'm John Cleary. As you heard, again, I work for Organic Valley, and our family also has a small farm in central Vermont. And watching that movie, it's interesting. It makes you think, in some sense, well, why do people keep doing this, right? It's so hard, and try something different, grow other crops. But it turns out there are, dairy actually is a high-value type of product to produce from the landscape. The problem is, our economic system hasn't always recognized that, or there's a lot of factors there. But traditionally, the idea of growing crops is kind of the first layer. If you want to add value to it, you can run those crops through hogs or poultry, or really want to add value to it, run it through dairy cows, and you're really concentrating your nutrients into a very high-value product. It's perishable. Traditionally, dairy was really like the kind of peak of both nutritional products, but also the kind of skill it took in farming to produce that kind of thing. It takes a lot of infrastructure. The other thing why dairy has persisted so long is it has very regular cash flow. Not always totally predictable because there's volatility, but you're selling product every other day, right? Trucks come taking it. Banks can look at that and say, okay, is cash coming in on a regular basis versus a lot of other farming is very seasonal, right? You grow crops all year and you sell them all in the fall. You know, but what if hail or, you know, you lose the crop during the growing season. So there's something about the predictability of the cash flow in a dairy system that really helps farmers, and for better and worse, it allows farmers to borrow money with that predictable cash flow. And farmers sometimes get into trouble, dairy farmers, by borrowing too much money. And sometimes banks have been complicit in saying, look, you need to expand to survive, and people can get too deep in debt, and that can be a big challenge. Looking at the farmers in that movie also, you know, I think those are the kind of people I work with, right? You know, probably 80% of the farmers that I work with as part of the Organic Valley Cooperative are these multi-generational, traditional New England family farms. And probably another 20% are kind of new entrants, people that are coming from outside of agriculture and starting dairies. So this idea of like, okay, we see how hard people work. I think there are some reasons why New England is a good place for dairy. It's a good, you know, grassland agriculture area. Some other parts of the country actually have a much harder time growing high quality grass compared to New England because of our cool climate. It's actually benefit for high quality nutritional grasses, adequate rainfall, these kinds of things. So we think, how can we help these farmers get paid more for their product? And that's what Organic Valley has been trying to do. To say to consumers, look, we know that you want to support these kind of farmers. If we can identify, you know, people that are doing a good job, that are farming sustainably, through our brand and through our cooperative, then we can return more of that money back to the farmer. And then on the farmer side, we're saying, look, consumers don't always know everything about farming. These organic standards are not perfect, but here's an effort to define what sustainable farming practices could look like. If you're willing to meet those standards, we've got consumers that want to support you. So that model is really very powerful, and we've been doing this for about 30 years now. And it's really kept a lot of farms in business, including, you know, one farmer featured in the video there, Leon Kors, is now a leader in our cooperative, and him going organic is helping him transition that farm over to his daughter and son-in-law. So I've just seen it be very powerful, and I'm still very optimistic about New England's, you know, future in dairy, despite these big challenges about how dairy has moved west and gotten bigger and can be done cheaper. We're still close to big population centers in New England. We've got consumers that are really tuned into a lot of these issues, especially about animal welfare, water quality, other environmental issues, and I feel like there is a potential solution there. So just looking at Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, now about 25% of the dairy farms are certified organic and selling organic milk. That's a big deal in terms of keeping this dairy infrastructure alive.
So if any of you have problems with insomnia, I have an audio tape on milk pricing to share with you, but otherwise hopefully we won't get into that too much. I want to keep my comments pretty brief because I'd like to get into more conversation, but you know, I realize I'm in New England, but one of the things that I sort of feel inspired to say is you would be hard pressed to find a dairy farmer anywhere on the planet that wouldn't express very similar concerns about how come I can't get a price that allows me to pay my bills with some regularity, and how come I've got all these consumer issues and environmental issues, and how am I treating my cows, and how am I treating my workers, and et cetera, that are bothering them. And of course, every part of the planet has its own particular texture, depending on what might be going on. But these are common concerns. I do a lot of work around the United States. I do a fair amount of work around the world and talk to people regularly about these issues. And again, I could find a handful of folks that would say I'm all good, but they would definitely be the exception. So this is not a New England issue, although it may have some New England textures. This is really a global issue. I can also tell you that this conversation goes back easily 100 years. The conversation that we're having now, it certainly isn't identical to what was happening in New England in the late 1800s. But in point of fact, expressions of concern, how can I survive? How can I get a decent price? What can we do to improve the marketing of our milk? Exactly were happening 100 years ago or more. Which kind of makes you wonder, are we so stupid we can't figure it out, or is this just you know, the way of the world? But nevertheless, that fact remains. So I look forward to what you'd like to talk about and see if I can help assist that conversation.
Well, I had something to do with who's up here in this panel, and I'm very happy they're here. Thank you for coming. And I really wanted to think about, is there a way of coming, I don't think that the mass milk market and its prices is the way that alternative food systems are going to survive. They're going to need their own systems and their own economies, and that's sort of the argument I make in my own research and so on. And I wondered if people could talk a little bit about, I know for one, Organic Valley is in itself kind of an alternative system. I've spent some time researching organic agriculture, although organic agriculture is okay, but I really think of it as just an example of an alternative system. And could we come up with an alternative system that could meet the needs of more farmers? And so, you know, are there other ways to sort of think about sort of how to bring particular agroecologies like those hillside farms that you know, have disappeared, but there's still these hill farms. So can they survive in this mass market economy, or are there ways that we could create alternative economies that are not necessarily artisanal cheese in farmers markets?
So maybe we could go to John then and ask if there's, you know, maybe other strategies you thought of beyond, or I don't want to say beyond organic, but apart from it. Are there any other types of values other than Organic Valley that we want to develop?
Well, you know, a lot of it, I feel like, what farmers tell us they need is, you know, fair prices, right? And there are a variety of ways we can try to achieve that, but I'll say with Organic Valley at the very beginning, we kind of set this tenet of fair and stable pricing. And dairy economists generally said, you just can't do that. You know, if you look around at other commodities, there isn't really a model about fair and stable pricing for other commodities. And part of the reason for that is that, you know, economists will say that pricing that changes based on supply and demand, those are giving you signals about what the market needs, right? You need some price indicators to tell you what's going on in the marketplace so that you can then meet those needs, and so that's actually very useful to have some volatility like that. The problem for dairy farmers is that it's a production system that cannot change or adapt quickly. You can't turn cows on and off. So if you're a crop grower, soybean prices go down, you can grow more corn and less soybeans, or more small grains. You know, you get a little more annual ability to adapt, whereas dairy farmers don't have that ability. Dairy takes a lot of capital, a lot of specialized equipment, and you can't just like turn it off just so you have one bad year and then come back in when a good year comes in. So what that volatility has done, I know I'm getting a little off, I don't want to get too far into dairy pricing, but that volatility generally means either bigger farms or farms with other types of sort of risk management strategies can survive those dips. Generally smaller farms go out, farm size keep getting bigger and bigger. So I think whether it's, you know, with Organic Valley, we've thought about, you know, some very specific things that help us achieve fair and stable pricing, and that part of that has been supply management. But there may be other systems that help achieve that too. But the other thing that has helped us achieve this, that people can learn from too, is it's really the power of our brand that has given us that stability. So we've kind of jumped through or past the middleman in some sense and said, if we can convince consumers, if we can have a direct relationship with consumers, you know, different from the farmers market connection, but still, you know, because there's we've got this processing, kind of gap in between. So we have to work a little harder to make that consumer connection. But making that consumer connection is part of how you can get to fair and stable prices. And there are other dairy co-ops with strong brands that achieve some of that as well, Cabot in particular. But I will say that in general, the dairy industry has not necessarily made a claim that they're trying to achieve fair and stable prices. They've sort of said, well, we're in a marketplace, it's competitive. Those who can be the most efficient, and can be competitive on a global market will have some real opportunities to survive. And during good times, even some reasonable times, conventional dairy farms can make good money too.
Is there a question?
Sure, as you wish.
So, or I can do that too.
I'll walk over. Yeah.
So, John, I was just gonna ask you to explain a little bit more of how Organic Valley does that supply balance, and how, what makes them be so different, and how do they manage that with the farms that they have commitments with? If you could, if that's not right, Terry, if you could just get into it a little bit more, because I do think that's part of the future, is to look at, and I question all the time why farmers aren't embracing that. I mean, it seems like there's more of a positive conversation around supply balancing, but it's been pretty negative to date.
Well, it's not easy. It's actually really hard to predict in advance what you need, especially with a perishable product. But I'd say it starts with this commitment. In our case, by our cooperative, say, okay, we're going to set this as a bar. We're going to try to do this about fair pricing. And we talk internally about this idea that with our cooperative that the farmer gets paid first. So we have target pricing. We say, okay, this is what we want to achieve for a price. As money comes in from the consumer, the money pays the farmers first, and the business runs on what's left over. It's good theory. It doesn't always work perfectly, but so it starts kind of from a philosophical commitment. Then on a practical level, the way it works with our farms, I'll back up 1 second. Generally, the challenge about supply management has to do with how farmers react to changing in prices. So, when prices are low, in order to pay your mortgage and things, prices are low, you generally need to sell more milk to cover your costs. So even though there's too much milk and prices are down, farmers traditionally make more milk, and that worsens things. When prices are high, you're like, oh, finally, this is my chance to make a little money, so you make more milk. So there's been this pressure, no matter what, to increase milk production. What we've done is, with our farms, each of our farms has a base that we're saying, okay, we're going to promise that we're going to buy at least this much milk from you all, based on your size. And when we start with a new farm, we look at the 3-year history. So if you're a 100-cow farm, we'll say, okay, you want to ship 2 million pounds of milk, that's your base. During good times, we'll take whatever milk you send. Because milk production goes up and down due to weather and other factors. Farmers, it's not something you can just sort of press a button and it happens. During good times, we take whatever milk they have. During times when we have too much milk, we say we're going to limit everybody to your base. There's a time in 2007 when we said, actually, we're going to reduce, we have too much milk, we're going to ask farmers to reduce their milk production by 7%. And so their base minus 7%, that's how much milk they can send to us. Any milk that they send above that, they got a discounted price for because we can sell that milk conventionally. So that base system, it's not always going to give you everything you want, but it's going to help you manage the supply to meet your needs. The challenge nationally, so we can do that within our own cooperative, nationally and on the conventional side, is it's hard to get farmers to agree that that's best for everybody. So we'll leave it there.
We might have follow-up too.
Sure, yeah, thank you.
Well said. All right, that was something else I was also interested in asking about before we go to the next question. I was telling Andy that I heard a podcast, a Planet Money podcast that involved him that talked about, this whole buyout system and how we limit supply, et cetera. And I feel like in the early parts of the podcast, they were talking about possible policy responses to this oversupply. And the Q word came out, quotas. It's like, can we actually implement some kind of hard limitations on supply? And then they said, oh, well, this is America, so we can't do that, or something like that. But I was interested, because when I heard the term base, to me that actually sounds like some kind of soft quota, or at least a soft cap. Soft because maybe you can still sell it, but there's some kind of there's a smaller subsidy or whatever you wanna call it. I mean, so that's the question I've had coming into today is could you, I mean, what do people think of something like a quota that maybe, because I feel like when we hear about quotas, it sounds hard, right? It's if you get this much and then like, that's all you get. But could something like more of a soft quota or soft cap be implemented at the national level, which is kind of where it sounded like you were headed, at least in terms of applying this to the national level? Whoever wants to.
Well, I know there has been a move for supply management in the United States. There's National Farmers Union is one organization that they've kind of traveled around the country. They call themselves the Road Show. They've gone to many states talking about supply management. I think they're in California this week doing their road show. I don't know if that will ever happen in the United States or not. You know, when I travel around Canada, I see the farming community looks much more prosperous. I can drive over the border from Canada and it, you know, becomes like deliverance. Immediately, when you cross the border, you see the farms are run down. The Canadian farmers, you know, repeatedly tell me how they're doing okay financially. You see new equipment, robotic milking systems, lovely farmsteads. So, that I think we have a different culture here in the United States, where it must always be the cheapest possible with the most, produced on the most competitive farms, the map I showed yesterday. I mean, I don't know if that would ever come about. Some of the co-ops do have a kind of what we would call a soft co-op, or a soft quota. Is it Land Lakes has sort of a base, like a quota type of program? Yeah, Agrimark at their annual meeting, I think last week, I had some discussion of trying to have like a 3-year, I think it was a 3-year rotating base average that you would pay the farmer for. That average, unless if you produced over that, trying to produce only what they could market well. So those were some possibilities in terms of the supply situation. And I keep hearing rumors and stories about, even more massive farms being built, and I can never quite verify it, but a friend of mine whose brother has a farm in Texas said, hey, have you heard about the new 100,000 cow farm starting up there? Which I already see the 100,000 cow farm in China on the border, where they're doing a joint venture to produce milk for more, the large urban communities. So
It's a city.
yeah. So it's, so this is, we hear these rumors all the time and we wonder how that would impact us. So have you heard about that, Andy? Do you know about?
The biggest farm I know of is in Oregon. It has 35,000 cows in one place. The next biggest one I know of is 20,000, 22,000. That's on the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. But there are a number of farm families that own 50 to 150,000 cows. They just don't have them all in one place. This sounds to me like a cluster of farms, not just one single farm, but I haven't heard about it.
Yeah, so, so sometimes, those of us who are smaller farmers really wonder where we fit in for the future and if we fit in at all. And particularly processors, from what I've seen in terms of working with our own little small independent, we have a little small co-op in my area where the farmers ship together, we hire our own transportation, our own inspector, and then we have a milk broker, or some of us have actually just gone and knocked on the door. Like one of the women, we had some women take over our board of directors and they just walked into Chobani and asked to speak to Mr. Ulukaya to sell milk. We try to, do things that way, but we wonder in the future, there are very large farms or large co-ops that would undercut us on price at a moment's notice. The processors actually like to have milk coming from a larger farm. It's a lot easier to pull up a tractor trailer load and blow in 70,000 pounds of milk in one stop. Than it is to, deal with a co-op like ours where we send a truck out on the road to pick up from several farms to fill a tractor trailer load of milk. So I guess for me, I'm, I have organic friends. I'm really not that much into organic. I don't want to hurt your feelings or anything, but the reason I'm not is because my sister is a veterinarian and we do like to be able to treat a sick animal with antibiotics, and I have seen on an organic farm, if an animal is treated once under the American rules, then they have to leave the farm. So I don't like that idea, and I understand that it's different in Europe and Canada, that you could treat an animal and they don't have to leave the farm. But the withholding time would be much longer. So from our point of view, we do like to give all of our animals a fair chance at a good life and not have to make them leave the farm early because maybe they had an accident or they were sick or, something like that. I'm more into the idea, and maybe I got this because just traveling around France, of regional products and pride in a region, and pride in maybe an ecosystem. So in my area, we're the Mohawk Valley, and I really believe there are many beautiful farms in the Mohawk Valley, and in different sizes. Some, most of my Amish neighbors are milking 15, and then we have neighbors, friends who are milking a lot more, several hundred. But I, believing that we're doing a pretty good job, I haven't heard complaints about pollution. We're still trying to maintain our ecosystems that we have, so I'm more in favor of the ecosystem kind of bio-regional approach where there's a pride in that particular region. So like when I was in France, I went to visit the French Farm Show several years ago, and there was great pride in the regions of France where, I went to a restaurant one night and I told the waiter that I was there to see the French cows, and he stopped the entire restaurant and stood up and said, "She is here to see the French cows," and the whole restaurant stood up and cheered. "We have the best cows in the world." And, I wouldn't see that in New York City, okay? First of all, I'd probably be attacked by a bunch of vegans and, just threatened with my life, and, which occurs occasionally. So I guess that's my thing, and hopefully it could fit, into hoping, I think some of the most important discussions are occurring in urban areas, and that would be, for me, it's always New York City. So I try to go into the city to speak with people, but like Mayor de Blasio was, announced that we meet on Mondays in the schools. I spoke with some of the activists, and they told me that their next target will be to remove chocolate milk from the school menu. So I'm like, well, that's not helping us upstate at all. And they're like, well, it has nothing to do with you. It's what we want our children to eat, and we're going to save the planet. So that's why I think the biggest conversations occur, and I always like to, I'm glad when we have something, like this. It's really super helpful.
Yep,
Questions?
okay.
Hi,
Take your
John.
cluster.
We spoke a little bit yesterday about my project. I've been interviewing dairy farmers in 3 different states, and 2 of them are Wisconsin and Vermont, where I've interviewed some Organic Valley farmers. And one of the things they've talked about with me is an incentive program that Organic Valley's offered, where they are incentivized financially to breed or produce milk from cows that have higher butterfat content. And I wanted to kind of ask you if this is maybe an adaptive strategy that might help bring a better premium for the milk that's being produced. It's got a higher butterfat, it's able to be used for different products, maybe marketed as higher quality, because it's something that they seem to really rely on in the past few years since they switched over to Organic Valley. I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
We'll take a few and then back to the front.
2 points. The alternative markets. We're seeing in New Hampshire now 4 plants that are bottling their own milk. They are actually able to buy local dairies around that are struggling, employ those farmers at a living wage, and they're able to sell. They're claiming that fluid milk is not going to be their primary growth opportunity. It's going to be into baked goods and whatnot. But it is connecting with the consumer. Another point with respect to that, so UNH did a survey on behalf of our Commissioner of Ag, who was looking to brand New Hampshire milk and give 50 cents per gallon directly to the farmer. And that survey was received very well. 75% would be willing to pay that extra 75 cents or extra 50 cents. Problem with the processors on separating that milk. So now we might have to go to a New England branding. So I do believe that the alternative market could have some potential solution to this. Wondering your thoughts on that. Second point on policy. So it seems that the politics of milk are regional. So the West, the Midwest, the South, and the Northeast. Our New England Dairy Compact was prevented from being renewed by these politics. Is there a way to break through those policy barriers so that we actually can have either a regional pricing system, a fair pricing system, redoing the whole milk pricing? So that would be my next question. And my third thought goes back to what we spoke about yesterday. I'm moved by seeing that film. I asked myself the question, so the steel industry went out, the sheep industry went out in the 50s, so the dairy industry is now on the ropes. What should the government say then? I don't know. But I'm thinking back to Abe Collins, selling environmental impacts. I guess that's the wrong word, but being able to sell environmental services, thank you. And is that something that we could support? Because clearly, given the statistics of the pasture land and what it's really doing communally, I'm wondering if we can't monetize that somehow.
Okay, I think we go back. Yeah, okay. We got a lot to think about, talk about.
So you start with the first question for John, which is about the subsidies for butterfat.
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole dairy industry is going through this trend where butterfat, the pricing is being driven now by the value of butterfat. For a long time, really, dairy cups have always priced based on components: butterfat, protein, other solids. These are tests that dairy farmers get back each week about what's in their milk. And generally, it was to the farmer's favor to have a cow that just makes more volume. The volume was what really mattered. And these values of butterfat and protein, they move up and down with various markets, cheese and butter markets as they're traded. For a long time, people thought that was bad, and that, again, incentivized, say Holstein milk, a cow that makes more milk with less butterfat, versus Jerseys. That trend has really changed dramatically. And with Organic Valley, it's actually been quite a challenge to our business because the thing is, if people want to buy a lot of butter, you take 100 pounds of milk, so you get 5 pounds of butter, you need to do something with all that skim that's left over. And if you can't capture a strong value for that skim, then you got to sell that butter for like $14 a pound. If that's all you're going to sell. So traditionally, we've had other good uses for that skim, and skim often is made into non-fat dry milk powder. You can store it, sell it later. Dry milk powders conventionally have been historic lows. And on the organic side now, we've gone through a little period of oversupply ourselves, so there's a lot of extra milk being put into powder. Those markets are down. There are things that you make with low-fat milk, mozzarella cheese, and obviously drinking milk. But I'll tell you, for example, our #1 seller in half gallons used to be 2% milk, now it's whole milk. Our skim milk sales, 0% fat, half gallons, sales are down 40 to 50% in the last 5 or 6 years. That's a major change in consumer habits. So our butterfat price has increased because we're trying to incentivize more fat. The market is telling us that we need more fat. So now farmers are saying, okay, I can agree for higher butterfat. Another thing on the organic side that I'll say is we've done a lot of testing of our milk for some of the beneficial fatty acids, CLAs, omega-3s. Those are things that are found in the fat component of the milk. So we have a 100% grass-fed line. We don't make a skim version of that because people don't want it. They want the good fats. So that the whole fat version is what sells. So anyway, but the whole industry is going through this thing about a change in the valuation of the components of milk.
This is actually, I think, a good example of sort of the cost or profit economics on a dairy farm. We've been rewarding farmers for milk fat since Babcock invented a test that made that easy to figure out. More recently, we've been also rewarding farmers for higher levels of protein, which is also a little bit related to how easy it is to test that. But you have to keep in mind, farmers don't get paid on a percentage of milk tests. They get paid on pounds that they sell. And so the equation between Holstein milk, which tends to be a little bit less nutrient dense versus Jersey milk, which tends to be more nutrient dense, is what is the cost of taking care of that animal, and how many pounds of milk fat, how many pounds of protein will she produce, and what will it cost me to produce those pounds of milk fat protein. And up until, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, the economics really favored the Holstein. Holsteins are getting bigger and bigger, and it's actually a pretty amazing genetic story. But more recently, there's been significant advances in the genetics for Jerseys to the point where they're making kind of a resurgence. There's other breeds of dairy cow, but those two are far and away the most common. So that we're starting to see more and more people interested in Jerseys, but it's actually not so much because of the milk fat, it's because of the higher levels of protein. Typically, Jersey milk gets shunted off into cheese production because the protein content drives how much cheese you can make. So there's a lot of economics going on in choosing how you're going to farm, what's production techniques will you use, what kind of animals will you use, and how does that translate into producing dairy foods. And I would say the dairy industry is pretty good about trying to convey those incentives through the pricing system, you know, as much as any pricing system can deal with a fairly complex industry.
I wanted to add, the women's group that I work with is Farm Women United. One thing that we were really looking at and emphasizing is making whole milk legal in the schools again. You know, currently we only have the schools can serve at 1% or skim milk, and I think they recently expanded that to 2%. No, the 2% is not allowed. Okay, so we're basically losing a whole generation of milk drinkers, where you get the milk in the school that tastes crappy. It's like skim milk that really, like on our farm we just kind of give the skim milk to our hired man as some pet pigs. So it's not, it's not a nutrient, I guess we would call it dense type of food product that's very satiating. There's been some studies on that. I don't know if you read the book Big Fat Surprise, that Nina Teicholz has done a lot of research on the American diet and looking at the role of good fat in our diets, in terms of not only cheeses, but also in the fluid milk that's consumed in the school system. I guess my women's group has been trying to instigate conversations by political candidates on food, so that our discussions don't just stay here in the in academia, but are out in the public. So we've been trying to do farming and food forums in different locations. And as I mentioned yesterday, we asked some people running for Congress in Pennsylvania if they'd be willing to do a food and farm forum, but they said that they didn't feel it was real. Well, one of them, the young Democrat, Mark Friedberg, I think his name is, said he would be interested, but it was something that he thought the public was interested in. But the other candidate said that, it's really, I don't get a lot of people asking me about food or farming. So I think instigating conversations about food and farming and the role of nutrition, nutrient-dense foods, quality foods is good. The other thing, we had a question on ecosystem services. So for us, our land taxes are so high that, even with a tax break, we're spending so much money, like this year with the prices being so low, trying to just even get the taxes paid. In my law office, there are many farmers who are way behind on their land taxes, and I really don't know how, they're going to catch up other than borrowing from friends or family. Some of them are after 4 years of losses, tapped out on their credit cards and coming up against where they've eaten into some equity so much, trying to hang on to the farm that, they don't know where they're at. And then, so, as far as payment for ecosystem services, I don't know, have the Soil for Climate people done anything on that, Carl?
I've heard there's at least one example, I think in Ohio, where such a system has been worked out, that a community is paying for ecosystem services.
Okay.
That's the only model that I'm aware of.
Yeah, so this is Carl from Soil for Climate, so I've been a Facebook friend for a long time, and I just met him last night in person, so that was another fringe benefit of this meeting.
Well, I'm just curious to follow up on that. What services are being paid for? How are they,
In terms of flood prevention specifically, at a higher level.
Okay.
Not specifically carbon drawdown, but actual benefits to the community. To avoid, hopefully, future infrastructure costs of roads or bridges washed out, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Just wanted, there's one of the things that, there's been this whole social movement around relocalization of agriculture. And what's kind of ironic is that dairy during the growth of that movement, it was dairy agriculture was the most local agriculture in around many of these cities where these social movements were happening. And that as some amount of relocalization is happening in terms of vegetables and so on, in fact, the reason why dairy had such a local system, besides the fact that it was very perishable, was that they had something called a milk market order, and they had a milk shed. And so they had boundaries, they had geographic boundaries around where milk could go to these, to the cities, in which, outside of those boundaries, were other kinds of production systems. And so, where, can we, one of the things I've been wondering, and I've done some work on this with Danny Block, is that, can we come up with a relocalized dairy, much more like the old, sort of strongly bounded dairy milk sheds that used to exist around cities as one way to create a sort of separate economy.
Got a bunch of questions, so we're gonna work back to front, so 1, 2, 3.
I'm just gonna follow up to that.
Okay, we'll follow.
Sorry, yes. Just thinking about that idea of compensating farmers for their ecological services. I'm in Massachusetts, and I'm thinking we already have state support for land conservation for agricultural easements. We have land trusts that are working on it, but it does still tend to favor, and this is, I think, Lorraine, where you're getting to that kind of redlining idea. It still favors the flatter farms,
Yeah, I always see it as extreme
conventional looking
redlining.
farms. But I think, and that's been going on for a long time, Melanie, your work kind of shows us that process for more than 100 years. But I just wonder if that's a way to kind of revalue those hill farms of saying, if we could sort of point out the multitude of ecological services that they provide. I don't think that's a question, but just a follow-up to that topic.
Hi, yeah, I actually have a follow-up question to Melanie's point. We often think about organic in tandem with sustainability, similar to how we think about local food in conjunction with sustainability as well. And I've noticed recently that organic milk actually travels larger distances from processor to vendor. So for example, Organic Valley milk, they can buy at local supermarkets here, travels from Winchester, Virginia, whereas like Hood milk travels from Barry, Vermont. So I was wondering if there were any conversations within Organic Valley about how to reduce those distances and therefore bring that distance more in line with the image that organic food projects, and then further to that, whether or not that would increase the financial viability of dairy farms, or if that's just kind of an irrelevant factor.
You want to answer that, John?
Sure, I can say, I'll tell you, in New England where our milk goes, our model has been not to own our own plants because the farmers have been wary of past history with cooperatives investing too much money in infrastructure and that kind of. So we use other plants. So most of our New England milk gets bottled at the Booth Brothers plant in Barry, Vermont. We also supply the majority of the milk for Stonefield Farm yogurt here in New Hampshire. We occasionally use the Cabot plant to make cheese in Vermont. But our model is for the drinking milk to be bottled in the regions where it's being sold and where the farms are, and then hard product to move. So for example, cheese we might make in Vermont, we're also going to sell in Pennsylvania, California, that kind of thing. We might make mozzarella in Ohio that gets sold here. So the fluid generally stays. The exception though is we try to build our supply chain so that when we're at our peak of spring flush production, which is a dairy thing that happens. We make more milk in the summer on grazing farms. We try to match our Northeast milk, which is more expensive, so our peak production meets our fluid demand during the summer. Then during the winter, when our New England milk supply is making less, but consumer demand is up, that's when we bring in milk from other adjacent regions. So milk will at times come in, say, from Ohio, Pennsylvania, occasionally even Virginia. So milk moves. And because it's a perishable product, that's one of our primary challenges, is how do you increase the efficiency of that supply chain so that milk moves as little as possible.
There's a little more of a supply chain story to this that I think is not, why would anybody know it? But as was mentioned, Organic Valley in particular utilizes the the processing facilities of other conventional processors. Organic milk is not a gigantic volume of the total market. So there's not that many processors that do this, and the ones that do it tend to bottle that milk once a week. They also tend to be processors that are able to do extended shelf life packaging. So you bottle all your organic milk on Thursday, you do it in what's called ultra-pasteurized processing environment where you have extended shelf life, and you distribute it through a cold chain that's typically larger than just local milk production. The Winchester plant in Virginia is owned by the Hood Company. It has distribution capabilities all over the eastern US and in fact nationally where they distribute their lactate milk. So this is part of a marketing supply chain ecosystem that goes beyond this notion of local. The Winchester plant doesn't get milk from all over God's earth because that doesn't make any sense. But once it's packaged and put in a stable container, then it can go pretty long distances and endure. So there's a good part of the organic story that's also a supply chain story. It's not just what happens on the farms.
So Andy, can I just ask, because I think it's really interesting the way organic milk seems to move differently. And part of it is also that there's only so many organic farms. So and I'm just wondering with John as well, it's that it's not like all the organic farms are sitting in the Mohawk Valley, right? There are people who've decided to go organic in all these different places. And so doesn't that make for a kind of crazy system where organic milk has to move all of these different places because you have to get it from like farms out there and then to processors over here and so on and so forth. And so it seems like in some ways it's technology. It's funny that organic is made possible by UHT, this other technology that enables that to happen. Is that the case?
Well, we do both what they call HTST, which is the lower temperature pasteurization, and the UHT. We try to have regional identification, so you can look on Organic Valley cartons that say Organic Valley New England Pastures. That's the HTST, not extended shelf life product, distributed more locally. UHT moves further. Retailers have driven the UHT market. Retailers basically demand that generally because it makes their inventory management much easier, have a longer shelf life. Our hauling costs are much higher than conventionally. Conventionally, generally you had a plant in one spot and a group of farmers that had a co-op around that plant, and it worked. Organic Valley was interesting. It started in Wisconsin in 1988. Then, a few years later, there's a group of farmers in Maine and Vermont that said, hey, can we do that too? And there's a group of farmers in Washington and Oregon that said, hey, we'd love to do that too, and can we find ways to join up and do it together? So we use about 60 processing plants across the country. We own 2 of them in the Midwest. It's a very complex supply chain. Yeah.
Thank you. I think these comments are great because they touch on this issue of structural impediments that not just the dairy industry, but almost all individual small farmers face, that there's an aggregated power structure and control structure owned by corporations that can limit access, and I bet you're not getting the same price that they're charging themselves for the processing of their milk. They are making a good penny on that, and that is exactly what is relevant, because this is where government and cooperatives and regional institutional structures can break up this imbalance of access to processing facilities, distribution capability, and so forth, which is really one of the larger problems that we as small farmers or emerging trend farmers, so to speak, to paraphrase what you were showing on your slide, Melanie, face in terms of disrupting existing markets. And the other 2 things that I would like to sort of have a little bit of a conversation or hear about is, we touched on this yesterday a little bit, is A2A2 genetics, and I'm happy to explain that if, and then the second one is dual purpose cattle, which have been in a quota system an incredibly good way to manage excess milk production in Europe, because you can feed it to your own beef calves or dual purpose calves, which then produce high-quality meat carcasses and become a product in addition to the milk that can be marketed. So A2 milk, for those of you who don't know, is about 6,000 years ago, so there was a genetic mutation in cattle that changed one molecule on a casein, on a protein in milk. And it's called beta casein, small Greek beta, B casein, and there's an A1 version and an A2 version. 99.9% of our milk supply comes from A1 cows because we have a predominance of over 90% of the milk supply coming nationally from Holstein cows, and they have almost 0% A2 milk. Why is this interesting? Because there's a whole slew of studies that link A2 milk to lowering of, or I should say the other way, A1 milk is correlated in medical studies and medical data analysis to a whole bunch of allergic reactions. A lot of people who think that they're lactose intolerant actually are allergic to this protein. It binds to your morphine receptors in your body, so you have this like really high, anyways. So it's a longer story. Out in California, we're starting to see A2 milk in the health food stores and Whole Foods and stuff like that. In New Zealand, where this was first pursued, and in Australia, this is a common thing. You walk in there and there's organic milk and there's conventional milk and there's A2 milk. So there's the interesting benefit is, or one of the interesting things is there's been, over the last 10 years, a lot of herds in the Northeast being bought up, mostly by Pennsylvania Amish farmers. Guernseys have a high percentage of A2, so it's easy to convert these herds. Why is that the case? Because these farmers have noticed in their own kids, so Amish tend to have a higher incidence of genetic issues because their population is very small, so you get more health issues, and especially kids on the spectrum of Alzheimer's or Asperger's types symptomology tend to react very highly to A1 milk and can actually tolerate A2 milk. So it's more easily digestible. All other ruminants, sheep, goats, and so forth, is all A2 milk. There's no A1 milk there. So just sort of a little intro there.
Anyone want to take a turn at tackling either the A2 milk or the dual use cow issue?
I'll tackle.
Come back.
Okay, so on A2 milk, I mean, I have the cell phone number, the guy who has the A2 testing lab in the Northeast, so I could test our cows. You know, I'm just curious to see what percentage of our herd would test on A2. I mean, I've heard both views. I think this is being studied. I think maybe one of the dairy groups is trying to do some studies on A2 milk. I mean, I've heard both ways. That A, it's just a bunch of hot air, but then I've also heard that there is, you know, that there is some validity to it, that certain people who can digest A2 milk better. So that would be a good, you know, good niche market. I have some friends who have Ashers and Guernseys. It's kind of hard to, you know, like organic milk, kind of hard to, you know, accumulate enough to, you know, you have to go around to a variety of farms to get to it. But, you know, it's interesting, and I think farmers are open to kind of take a look at it. On the dual purpose cows, I am a big fan of dual purpose. So for those of you who don't know what that is, that means that the animal can serve as both a milk producer and a beef producer. So in Europe, there are many milk dual purpose breeds. So my sister has her like a breeding bulls catalog. She likes to sit up at night fantasizing about breeding our cows to different dual purpose bulls, and then my brother and I always say, no, come on. So, but if one thing is trying to sell the beef, we have real limitations if we try to sell beef in New York. I don't know how it is in New England, but you know, what we do try to sell grass-fed dairy steers to our friends. You know, we do a lot of hamburger and that. But the nearest slaughterhouse is an hour away. You know, and it's $1 a mile, you know, trucking to get the animal there and then to bring them back processed. Then you also have to pay extra if you're just slaughtering a handful of animals. A USDA inspector has to be on the scene, and that's a lot more. So it's not like, you know, where you're Cargill and you're slaughtering, I don't know how many thousands of cows they slaughter at a plant a day, thousands perhaps. you still pay for that same one USDA inspector to stand there. So, and then, marketing of beef is not that easy. I was kind of hopeful that there might be a move in New York City, markets to incorporate New York State, grown beef, into our schools. There is one program, a woman owns a company called Slate Foods. She, sends out, a representative who used to, work with New York State livestock processing to look at the cows, buy good dairy cows that are maybe no longer productive dairy cows, but can now be used for beef, and selling the beef as hamburger in the city schools. So that is something that's actually underway in our state. There have been some co-ops where farmers have tried to raise beef, and some of them have been almost a dual-purpose type of animal, but it's been tough going to get the concept across. So I find it very fascinating, and I highly recommend if anybody ever has extra money to go to the French Farm Show in Paris. At the end of February every year, it's a standing thing, Le Salon de l'Agriculture, and you'll see all the beautiful dual purpose. There are also even tri-purpose cows where they're also used for hauling, for pulling oxen carts and things like that. So if you really want to go all the way, go tri-purpose. But it's fascinating, and I think in the United States we don't really appreciate the European approach.
I would like to add to this that I think both of these have really important consumer dimensions that we need to be mindful of. So, the A2 thing, I think, is going to boil down to whether or not consumers can actually tell the difference. And some, I think, probably will, but I'm pretty convinced by previous innovations of this type that if a consumer can't tell the difference, then they're not going to buy it just because you tell them or somebody else tells them that somehow it's better for you. And really, there's a number of examples where this has been the case. On the dual purpose thing, again, I think there's the consumer side of this. At the end of the day, there's a whole lot of consumers that are going to walk into the store and they're going to say, which milk, which seems to me to be one thing's pretty much the same as the next, is the cheapest? Which beef is similarly? And historically, when we've looked at dual-purpose cattle, which, that used to be a normal thing in dairy, you ended up with small cows that didn't produce a lot of milk and didn't have a lot of carcass weight, which didn't really seem like a big formula for making money, either as a raiser of meat animals or dairy animals. The European system's different. European beef growers are not like American growers, so dual-purpose fits better in the system. The alternative cost contrast isn't as great. So there's a question of what works for producers, but there's also a question of what will the American consumer accept, or how many American consumers will accept X or Y.
Come right up. She's been patiently waiting. Thank you. And came all the way from Pace.
Yeah. So when I raised my hand to ask a question, we were just talking about trying to get whole milk back into schools. So I know that diet trends and nutrition science definitely has to affect the dairy industry and most agricultural industries. So I'm just curious on understanding more of the perspective or the relationship between the dairy industry and nutrition science, and if there's any kind of actual evaluated data on how diet trends are affecting dairy sales or agricultural sales. So I have an add-on to the question.
Yes, a few weeks ago I read an article that most millennials are lactose intolerant, and as years go on, it's increasing. Do you think that affects dairy production also?
I think one of the things that I suspect is happening is the rise of the keto diet in terms of fat.
So nutrition and health and dairy's role is a ginormous topic of absolutely global interest. I've been at multi-day long conferences about that particular topic, so let me just make a couple of quick points. Everybody here is familiar with food pyramid, right? The purpose of the food pyramid was to take something inherently complicated and distill it into something that was sort of user-friendly and provided easy guidance. Unfortunately, complex questions often don't have like super simple answers. And this is a good example. We are just now launching the second phase of an update to the dietary guidelines, which are a collaborative effort between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration. A couple of years ago, the first phase was completed, which was an external panel of a large group of scientists from a cross-cutting set of areas whose responsibility was basically to do a meta-science review, to say, if we look at the current state of knowledge related to diet and health, what do we think this science, this body of literature is telling us about how what we eat impacts our healthfulness down the road? And that report fairly dramatically tweaked, nudged, changed our understanding, particularly about things like dietary cholesterol, dietary fat, saturated fat in the diet. Still big red flags on sugar and salt, but it added a lot of texture that previously were the result of epidemiological studies that were really about correlation. They really weren't about causation. Where this ends up is going to be interesting, but there's a whole lot of social science involved in this because you have a full generation of dietitians and nutritionists who have been taught that consuming saturated fat is certain death. And to kind of get that ship to think a little bit differently is not so easy. The dietary guidelines are, USDA must adhere to the dietary guidelines when it gives subsidies to schools for school lunches. The dietary guidelines lead them to say, skim or 1% white milk, skim chocolate milk, with kind of twitchiness about chocolate milk because it has some sugar in it. The sugar is in there because cocoa is bitter. If you don't put something into it, it's not so pleasant. Whether or not the new dietary guidelines will relax this somewhat is now the beginning of a really gigantic debate between people, dairy industry representing a big group, saying there are bad diets, there are bad lifestyles, there aren't bad foods. And other folks who say, yeah, blah, 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 this stuff is bad, you shouldn't eat it. And we'll see how that sorts out. But it's a gigantic conversation, and I agree that this is really shaped. The issue is not how much milk we sell in schools in 2020. The issue is how much people want to drink milk and consume dairy foods in 2030 and 2040.
Yeah, one thing to say about nutrition, we know that our diet as Americans has shifted dramatically to one that where, a vast amount of our food is based on corn and soy, right? Either, kind of processed versions of those things or livestock that are fed those things. And that has created this imbalance between omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids in a lot of our diet. And there's a lot of science that's saying that's part of the increase in these inflammatory related diseases that we're facing. And so we've taken this on as a challenge to say, okay, we want to work with our farmers to help them do a better job grazing so their milk is healthier for you, right? And we can see that on average our milk has twice the levels of omega-3 fatty acids than the conventional milk that we test on the stores. And our 100% grass-fed is something like 4 times the levels. Now, dietitians will also say, well, milk actually is not that big of a source of those fatty acids, so you got to drink an awful lot of milk to really meet your dietary needs of those. But we kind of did a little study. We put together, a diet looking at these things. Well, if you have a glass of milk with your breakfast, that's grass-fed, and the cheese, on your sandwich is grass-fed, and the meat in your burger for dinner is grass-fed. If you add that entire diet, you actually can meet those your body's needs for these beneficial fatty acids in a holistic way. So it's not just about saying you got to drink 12 glasses of milk or something, but if we say, look, we really change our whole diet in terms of livestock products, we really can create a healthier population. So I'm a big believer in that.
So John, I'll be remiss if I didn't ask you a question that was on everybody's mind yesterday, at least when we did the breakouts, which was we had this really interesting conversation about labor, and we saw that migrant justice and a particular dairy farmer started to realize that they were both maybe the word's too strong, but kind of victims of a system where neither is really benefiting. And migrant justice has really focused at the top of the food chain. So I wondered if Organic Valley has really formulated a response if migrant justice and some farmers come to you as they did to Ben & Jerry's and say, we want a Milk with Dignity program with Organic Valley. I'm kind of putting you on the spot there.
That's good. Well, we've been participating in, for a number of years in a working group that's been called Domestic Fair Trade, which incorporates these kind of social values as well. We understand what fair trade means when we're talking about chocolate and things from other parts of the world, but looking at fair labor practices domestically. Often our farmers will say, well, we don't really use a lot of migrant labor, generally it's family labor. But also the farmers will often say, I support these ideas, but I just don't need another certification program, right? Our organic certification, and an animal welfare audit that I do, and a water quality audit, and a nutrient management plan. So they just don't want more regulation. They want to do the right things. It's interesting, as a farmer-owned co-op, sometimes, us as staff, we say, oh, we want to do all the things, right? Sometimes the farmers say, we want to keep ourselves a little more focused on certain things. So there's some resistance from the farmers about another level of either certification or verification. It is a big deal. Our Vermont farmers, I probably have 1 or 2 farmers that use migrant labor here in New England. But say our farmers out west, who on average are milking, 200 to 300 cows, certainly use labor forces from Mexico and Central America. It's fairly common. So I think it is an issue. I don't have an answer. One thing I'll add about the labor issue that I see locally here relates to the fact that this family farm, kind of culture where the farmer said, I haven't been milking in, 39 years or something. The new people who are coming on, who are interested in farming, don't want to have that same lifestyle. So it's a different kind of labor thing. We're having a hard time finding young farmers that want to adopt a dairy farm lifestyle that locks you into a 12-hour apart milking schedule. And robotic milking could be a solution to that. People often think that robotic milking is these big technologies for the big farms. Turns out robots, a single robot milks 50 or 60 cows. That's a family farm size. You go to the Netherlands, where it's very family farm scaled, and almost half the farms, or maybe more, are using robots. It's good for, it's not abusive to the cow or anything like that. Sometimes people think this kind of technology can't be natural in some sense. But these robots, it's actually very interesting that, on the other hand, I don't want to take people out of agriculture either, right? I want to see more people working in agriculture. And we need to value this labor more. I want to see Americans be willing to milk cows too. But who wants to, I shouldn't put it quite this way, but if your farm is big enough, you need people that do nothing but milk cows for 12 hours. That's not a great job, right? Just farming should be a diversified thing, like where you're a veterinarian and you're fixing fences and you're making crops. It's this wonderful blend of all different types of skills. That's what keeps your life interesting. And on a family scale farm, that happens. But if you're just in a milking parlor all day long, and it's not a great working environment.
I see a follow-up. Did you still want it? Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to follow up on the ecosystem services, because I think when we talk about that, there are different entry points to that. I think those kind of payments. So I would say it's actually a fairly robust conversation happening in many states about payments for ecosystem services. I think the challenge has been, we do get payment for ecosystem services for climate and water quality. They typically come through grant programs. So we haven't really integrated them into the marketplace. And I think one of the challenges has been is the level of the cost for that verification is huge. That's been a barrier to getting a robust enough incentive to make a difference. And I think the other piece of it, I think we should be real about, and John alluded to it, is the fear from the farming community that an incentive becomes requirement. And which is certainly, I think the environmental community is sort of pushed that. And we're in a place where we need to figure out a reasonable verification requirement, but enough incentives to help farmers do the long-term work that they need to do. It's not just a one-off practice, but how do we do comprehensive work? And I do feel like payment for ecosystem service gets picked up in marketing as well. So some companies are picking up that additional environmental quality or benefit in their marketing, so it's not a direct payment, but I think there is a more robust environmental services market out there, but frankly, there's a lot of tension between, I think, the environmental community and the farming community about how you quantify that, what's real, how you sustain that, and I think there needs to be more dialogue about where are the sort of revolutionary middle ground that I think would open up opportunities to them.